Welcome back to episode 12 of the Goblin Cast. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at some of the most hateable houses in A Song of Ice and Fire. In part 1, we'll be looking at House Frey, the people behind the Red Wedding. In part 2, we're going to look at House Peake, a house that has very much lost its power, but when you look at the lore of Westeros and really the stuff happening before the main books, House Peake used to be a very powerful and prominent house. So we're going to look at their fall from power and why so many hate them overall. And in the third part, we're going to look at not exactly a house history, but a history of the Dreadfort, the castle of House Bolton. So the two kind of go hand in hand. We'll talk about a little bit in the origins of House Bolton mixed in with the origins of the Dreadfort and everything we know about it. So let's not waste any more time and dive into the most hated houses in Westeros. So House Frey is very unique and different from almost every other house we really talk about. So every time I come on here, I'm always like, oh, this house is, originated from the First Men. They maybe had land in the deep north, all that kind of stuff. They have this ancient history that we can go back thousands of years for. House Frey is not like that. They're only about 6 centuries old. They're a little older than, for instance, the Targaryen dynasty. They haven't been around much, and that has really led to a stigma of their house. Because of them not having this really great history or ancient history, many houses look down on them. We talked about the Blackwoods and Brackens. They have been at each other's throats for so long, they don't even know necessarily what the conflict even is about or how it even started. They are 2 ancient houses that possibly were both kings at one point. House Frey has never been that ever. They have been in a situation where they've steadily grown in power and even gotten more power than some of these ancient houses like the Blackwoods and Brackens. They've never really had full control, really until now in the main story when they've kind of risen to power over the Riverland. And we also don't necessarily know how the first Lord Frey came to be in terms of what did this person do to be granted lands and to become a lord. It kind of strikes me as something similar to say for instance, Davos. Davos becomes a lord because of what he does during Robert's Rebellion. Could that be something similar here with House Frey? I just don't know. There is no indication of how their house truly started. We do know that the first Lord Frey was granted lands and status and immediately began building a massive bridge over the Green Fork of the Trident. This person seems very intelligent as well. How do you make your power grow? You go to a position where there's not a ton of houses nearby. Like the closest to the twins is going to be really the Mallisters at Seaguard. But you also have a lot of land that people are always trying to cross, and there's not a lot of good bridges between some of the rivers of the Riverlands. It creates a situation where if you want to get to one side of the river or the other, you have to pay a toll, you have to pay a tax, and that's exactly what we see in the main story with Robb. So it could also point to the idea that maybe this original person that led House Frey was known for their ability to work the economy or finances, something along that line. They could understand an opportunity here, maybe a business kind of minded person. Again, there's just not a lot to go off of. But now we know this first Lord Frey would not actually complete this task. It would be under his grandson, who would complete the Great Bridge and then also added wooden keeps on both sides. These were then later rebuilt into stone, becoming the iconic twin castles, aka the Twins. So you see that natural progression because wooden keeps aren't really all that powerful. They can be burnt down. So the Twins very quickly become a source of power because how do you siege the Twins? Well, you have to be on both sides of the river to be able to do so. And if you're already trying to get through the Twins, that's going to become a really difficult situation. You're going to lose a lot of men doing so. And so the Twins instantly becomes this really defensible position that's almost unheard of in the Riverlands. Think about the Riverlands. We always talk about that being the place that everybody goes to do warfare. There's nowhere really to hide. The geography of the Riverlands does nobody any services. I mean, Riverrun is also kind of a hard castle to siege as well because of kind of the same issue because you have the different rivers, so you have to encamp it on multiple sides. But the Twins is like that, but to an extreme. It's extremely difficult to deal with. And so that's a big point as to why the Twins lived for so long, as they were just a nuisance to try and take out. But over the years, the Freys would grow rich by charging tolls to anyone who wanted to pass. Over time, they became the most powerful bannermen of House Tully, though many older houses still considered them upstart toll collectors rather than true nobles. And that is the case. I mean, House Frey doesn't have noble origins from what we can tell, and the way that they got their power was through tax collection. It was through having a bridge, more or less. But my big thing here is, why didn't you do it? You know, there's a clear issue in the Riverlands that there's not a lot of crossings. Why not make your own bridge and do exactly what the Freys do? I can't blame the Freys for making a great business decision that obviously helped them. And that's another thing that we have to look at with House Frey is House Frey has a very bad reputation, especially in the normal story because of, well, Walder Frey mainly. But at this early point, like, we don't have any indication that the Freys were not loyal to people that they were serving under. We have no indications that the Freys, for instance, would wait out fights or they were quote-unquote cowards. We have none of that indication. And so one of the things that I think really turns the Freys against everybody else, and especially when you see the current Walder Frey come to power, is when you have generations of which you're being treated like trash. Like, even though you are a powerful house, by all accounts, people are not taking you seriously. Like, for instance, Edbjorn being married to a Frey actually makes a lot of sense in terms of, okay, the Freys are your most powerful bannermen. That would happen all the time in the North. Like, think about how many times a Stark would marry one of the other houses in the North. It's actually unheard of for the Starks to marry anyone in the South. And so when you think about that for a second, like, it's kind of crazy to me how the Freys, while being one of the most powerful houses, especially in the Riverlands, gets looked over so easily. That does not the same stigma that, say, the Blackwoods or the Brackens have. And so you can see where the issue arises, why when we skip a little bit later on, get closer to the main story, you're going to see that the Freys have genuine arguments to be upset and treat people the way they do, but at the same time, it's also going to lead to their fall as well. At some point, we also do know that the Freys attempted and failed to conquer Greywater Watch in the Neck. Don't know any circumstances really about that outside of, well, they are bordering like neighbors, and there could have been some squabbles over territory. We just don't really know. We do see the issues between the two sides coming from the Walders end up at Winterfell, and then also the Reeds as well in Book 2, but not a lot there to really discuss. Now, I do want to point this out specifically. This is not a video where we're going to talk about every Frey and every action they ever did throughout Targaryen history or whatnot. This is going to be mainly focused on their fall, like what led to, A, them rising to power to the point where they're even really above the Tullys in the main series, and then also their fall. So I'm not going to be focusing on every little detail. But just to also point out, like, the Freys were not the Freys that they are in the normal story. They have many moments in which they actually go to war. So, for instance, they backed Aegon during his conquest against Harren the Black. They also, in 43 AC, would end up backing Aegon the Uncrowned, who would be killed by Maegor the Cruel. They would take part in the Dance of the Dragons, fighting alongside Daemon in the Blacks. So the Freys didn't sit out the war. Like, they were very present, especially in the early Targaryen wars. Now, this would seem to start to change during the Blackfyre rebellions. Now, the Freys are like that prime house that would betray the Targaryens and or go for the Blackfyres. They're a second-tier house that's trying to rise even further into power, and we see that start to happen maybe in the second Blackfyre rebellion, but the Freys smartly flee White Walls before anything actually goes down. And so what I think is interesting is you start to see already the Freys starting to change. They're trying to now gain more power over even someone like the Tullys. There are some notable things we know about House Frey, like at the tourney of Harrenhal, but not really relevant to what I want to discuss in this video. There's also some other stuff in there as well during the Blackfyre rebellions, but again, I don't think nearly as relevant to what I want to discuss in this video. So this would then begin the long reign of Walder Frey. Now, Walder Frey is in a lot of ways the architect of the rise to the Frey power, but also the fall of House Frey. Because on one hand, Lord Walder would make House Frey grow tremendously in size because of fathering dozens of children, and because he fathered dozens of children, legitimized several bastards, it just created a huge family tree. Now, on one hand, that's good because that means you have a lot of people that can carry out your will. It's expanding your potential marriage alliances. But on the other hand, it pushes alliances within the Frey house itself. It starts becoming every man for themselves, and a lot of that seems to come directly from Walder Frey. One of the clearest examples we get of this is Merryt Frey at the end of A Storm of Swords, and he really kind of spells out how the Frey hierarchy goes. And one thing that is never really present with the Freys, and that they have that reputation in Fire and Blood, for instance, it's never there until Walder Frey takes over. So Walder Frey is the person that we need to really talk about in this video, and that just seems very obvious. So there's a couple of things we can kind of point to that really annoyed Walder Frey personally. One, the Blackfish denied marrying any of his daughters. We also see that Tywin Lannister specifically kind of, I wouldn't say shamed Walder Frey, but outly opposed the marriage of Jenna to Emmon Frey. During Robert's rebellion, Walder also arrived at the Battle of the Trident once it was already won. It seems very clear he was just going to arrive once the other side had more or less won, so that he wouldn't be on the losing side. This is exactly what Lord Tywin does, so we discredit Walder for this, but we also seem to credit Tywin. So I just want to point that out, a little bit of an inconsistency there. But this would kind of start the idea of the Freys being untrustworthy, not loyal, being cowards, being everything that we know of them in the main story. And so everything that had already been happening to the Freys for the years before Walder Frey had taken over, as like how everybody looked down on them, it was even worse now because they were making themselves look like not great people. So you had the mixture of all these houses didn't like the Freys because of classism, I would say, and then also now the way that they were acting. And so as we get into the main story, House Frey has been slowly gaining more and more power, mainly because of their tolls and how many men that they can command. Like, for instance, the Freys commanded a lot of men, way more than any other house in the Riverlands, outside of if you want to consider the Tullys, given they control, like, all of the men. But the Freys were by far one of the biggest supporters for Robb that he needed. And so when you come into the main story, the Freys, the one big weakness that they have is they have no real way of elevating their power. They have no marriage alliance into one of the big houses that really matters. Like, yeah, the marriage alliance to the Lannisters is interesting, but it doesn't like place any of the Lannisters to maybe marry into who's going to rule Casterly Rock. Like, for instance, Jaime, or marrying Cersei. Like, they don't have any of those big marriages. And so when they get the opportunity, Walder Frey specifically, to improve that station, to make the Freys now become part of the King of the North plotline, more or less, having a Queen of the North, that's really intriguing because now you elevate your status even further. So the Freys, their rise is that. It's about getting to that next level. That's what the entire story of A Song of Ice and Fire is for the Freys. So as they're doing it, they're making calculated moves. Now, we know Robb ends up breaking that. That turns the Freys against the Starks, and for a lot of reasons, because of everything we've talked about in this video. It's just that reminder that all these houses look down on them. And so, Walder Frey, not having the best morals, he turns against the Starks, mainly because it allows him to elevate his position. Not only is he going to get Rosalind to marry Edmure, it's going to cause a situation in which the Freys kind of come to their claim to power. They become more or less in charge of the Riverlands. And that's not to say like they are the paramounts of the Riverlands, of the Trident, or any of that stuff, but they do elevate in power quite heavily. The only people that were really above them are now basically gone and or are imprisoned by the Freys. And that is like the eclipse of their power. That is the strongest that House Frey has really ever been. But as we know, in the story, the Freys are not doing well in the north. It seems like Stannis is going to beat them. If Stannis doesn't, it might be Jon, maybe the Wildlings, maybe it'll be some other contingent of the north, maybe the Manderleys. That big force that's up in the north likely is going to fail. We're already seeing in the south, aka the Riverlands, the Freys are being picked off by the Brotherhood. And also there might even be a plan by Lady Stoneheart to avenge the Red Wedding. The Freys are completely falling from their power. The Red Wedding, the thing that defines their house now in the story, will also define their doom. And that's the thing with House Frey is they have a very steady, long rise to power, but they're going to have a very quick falling off of power. House Peake. They are by far one of the most hated houses in the entirety of A Song of Ice and Fire. I think maybe House Frey is more hated, but outside of that, like, the Peakes are your stereotypical, nobody in the community likes them. They have no people that you look at and like, oh, this is this heroic figure. They are just not great people overall. That's shown throughout Fire and Blood. That's shown in the Dunk and Egg novellas. They are horrible. But one thing that's very much present with House Peake is House Peake has fallen from grace. Now, not to the extent of, say, maybe like House Velaryon, how they've kind of fallen to be a very minor house. House Peake was definitely one of the most powerful houses in the Reach, and by now they've kind of faded, I don't want to say into irrelevancy, but they're not like a house that's talked about in terms of like the big players in the Reach. Like when you think about in A Song of Ice and Fire, when you think about who's backing like House Tyrell, the houses you think about are like the Hightowers, you think about the Tarleys, you think about the Redwynes. The Peakes have basically no role in A Song of Ice and Fire at all. Now, they have quite a big history, but here's what I'll say. There's a reason by the time we get to the main series, they're quite a minor house. And this could also be that George didn't necessarily have their whole history thought out before writing the series. So then when he went back and made Fire and Blood and the Dunk and Egg novellas, he added more of the Peakes. He adds quite a lot, especially towards the back end of Fire and Blood Part 1, and especially in the third novella of the Dunk and Egg series. So House Peake is known for having this sigil of having 3 different castles with like an orange background. Now, distinctively to talk about with their history, House Peake didn't actually have 3 castles until they eventually ended up taking Dustinbury from the Manderleys. So the Peakes must have had a different sigil. Now, it could have been something similar to like House Frey having the twin towers, more or less, with the bridge. Maybe that's kind of how House Peake was. They had the 2 castles, not the 3. And so they just changed it once they got a hold of a 3rd castle. But we know that they are a Marcher Lord from the Dornish Marches, and they are a house that in a lot of ways is described as being land poor, which is rich in stone and soil, but in pride as well. They're not exactly the most powerful house in terms of being rich, which is kind of ironic given the Reach is known for being wealthy. You think about House Tyrell, they're one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest house in Westeros by the time of the normal story. It shows that House Peake already had not a great foundation in terms of how do they increase their wealth. And so when you see them trying to climb the ladder of the Game of Thrones, trying to take over being, the leaders of the Reach, this is probably a lot of why that is, because they're trying to get that wealth that they see in so many other houses in the Reach. But going back to the origin of House Peake, they are of an ancient house of the First Men, and it's also said that they descend from Garth Greenhand and one of his daughters, which is really interesting given that they have a very deep-rooted history within Westeros. Now, we really don't know a lot about them in terms of their early history outside of they had a similar relationship to, say, the Starks and the Boltons. We know there are many conflicts between the Peakes and the Manderleys, and you guys might be thinking, well, wait, the Manderleys, aren't they in the north? Yeah, the Peakes are basically the reason that the Manderleys get pushed out of the Reach, along with the Gardeners as well, and end up going into the north. And you would see minor squabbles. I guess I shouldn't say minor, but major squabbles as both sides were always marrying into, at the time, the Gardener kings. Now, the Gardeners were the rulers before the Tyrells, before Aegon's conquest. And so the Peakes and the Manderleys were both consistently marrying into that family, kind of similar to the way we think about, say, House Tyrell. Mace Tyrell ends up marrying like a Hightower. It'd be kind of like that similar idea where the Peakes were like your secondary house. They weren't the main house in power, but they were a house that was very connected to that main house. And so the Manderleys and the Peakes could also be maybe equated to a video I talked about already this week in the Brackens and the Blackwoods of just being like these secondary houses that are always at each other's throats. Now, here, the Peakes would have a very different result than, say, the Brackens or the Blackwoods. Now, when the Peakes and Manderleys would try to take control of the Reach through basically the woman line of the Gardener house, it was left to Osmond Tyrell, the High Steward, who made common cause with the other lords of the Reach and actually defeated both the Peakes and the Manderleys. They then kind of both then submitted to the Gardeners more or less again. And as the history would go on, House Manderley would be driven into exile from the Reach by Lord Lormar Peake upon the behest of King Persian III Gardener. And this seemed to be because House Manderley was growing in power in the Reach. They were becoming much more of a threat. We don't know necessarily all about this conflict. Like, we don't know if the Manderleys were, say, flaunting their wealth, flaunting their power, and that made them disliked. Or was this just an excuse for the Gardeners, aka also influenced by the Peakes, to take over their lands, to help, gain more power for themselves, while also stripping the Manderleys of their own power. So that would be the end of their conflict. And House Peake, this would be kind of like the heights of their power, because they would actually end up getting the seat of House Manderley and would now have 3 fairly good castles. And they would also earn some of the incomes, of course, from the Manderley lands. So it would help improve the wealth of House Peake. So in terms of House Peake, this is where the Velaryons are during the beginning of the dance. They're kind of at the heights of their power. They have multiple dragon riders. They have their line going on the throne, more or less. Well, they're saying it is, right? We know Laenor's children with Rhaenyra were not actually probably his, so The Velaryons weren't going to actually be on the throne, but their name kind of was. Not important to this video. And this is like where the Peakes truly became, well, Peake. They kind of started to become on top. And this is even further shown just seeing how many times the Peakes actually married into the Gardeners. It was said that there were 7 Peake maidens that became the queen of all the Reach. So they were a very powerful house. And it's also known that House Peake was marrying their daughters off to places like House Redwine, House Rowan, House Costain, the Oakhearts, the Osgreys, the Florence, and the Hightowers. So they were fairly well respected in terms of they were getting a lot of good matches, and their power was beginning to swell. Now, we don't know much about House Peake in terms of before, like the after the dance era. We know a couple things. We know, for one, they were greatly affected by the Field of Fire. Unlike House Hightower, who, for the most part, kept a lot of their strength, power, and influence because they stayed out of the Field of Fire, House Peake was not so lucky, and this is going to start a trend of House Peake always picking the wrong side. As Lord Armyn Peake and his sons would perish on the Field of Fire, they would also lose their close ties to the Gardener Kings, as, like I just got done talking about, they were very close to the Gardeners. They had a lot of influence with the Gardeners. That was no longer the case. Now House Tyrell was coming into power. And remember, House Tyrell had been responsible for actually defeating the Peakes in the years past. So there's no good relation here from the Peakes to the Tyrells. There's no quick in for House Peake. So House Peake lost a lot of influence because of the defeat of the Gardner House and it being completely extinguished. There isn't really much to note then about House Peake in the years following. We have like some throwaway Peakes that don't really matter all that much. Like there's a random Lord Uther Peake who marries one of Queen Alysanne's companions. During the Great Council, House Peake would back Viserys Targaryen, as of it would seem like most houses ended up doing. During the Dance of the Dragons, though, this is when we'd start to see the Peakes play a fairly sizable role. They still were a powerful house in terms of what they controlled. They just didn't have the influence, but they were able to garner some forces, and they ended up supporting the Greens. Once again, they technically support the losing side, just given the fact that the Blacks kind of win. I don't know, both sides really lose, but in terms of who actually wins by the end of it, it is the Blacks. So House Peake, once again, kind of lose. Now, Lord Unwin Peake, which most people will know he's not exactly the most likable guy in the world, he would take command of the Green Army from the Reach after the Second Battle of Tumbleton and led its retreat. After the death of Lord Corlys Velaryon, Lord Peake was given a position as one of King Aegon III's Targaryen's regents, and he actually eventually becomes one of the most powerful people in the entire realm. He became the protector of the realm and hand of the king. But basically, he was trying to force a bunch of things on Aegon III, and he was someone that was trying to abuse his power. He's very similar to Otto Hightower, just not nearly as clever. And so that's why a lot of people dislike House Peake in a lot of ways, because they're kind of not the best dudes. We just had a Dance of the Dragons, and here is Lord Unwin trying to get his daughter, more or less, on the throne, trying to manipulate events once again. That completely fails, and Lord Unwin Peake is basically removed from his position. Another stint of Peake, I would say bad luck in terms of choosing the wrong side, and also just abusing your power, being completely stupid. Now, the next time we would get a notable mention of the Peakes would be during the Blackfyre era, another huge, massive mistake from House Peake. House Peake is one of the staunchest allies to the Blackfyres. Now, anybody that knows anything about the Blackfyres know they lose a lot. But if you're the Peakes, it makes sense for you to back them because you're trying to climb the ladder. You're a secondary house that has only lost power and influence being under the Tyrells. This is the perfect opportunity to try and climb that ladder. Unfortunately for them, the first Blackfyre Rebellion would not go their way at all. And this would be the start of their downfall. I mean, a lot of the other moments beforehand, like, yeah, they lost stuff, they lost influence. They would lose 2 of the 3 of their actual castles because of the failure of the first Blackfyre Rebellion. They only controlled now Starpike. Gorman Peake, who had already been part of backing Daemon Blackfyre, now dug himself an even deeper hole as he was a big orchestrator in the second Blackfyre Rebellion, which is not even, in my opinion, it really shouldn't even be considered a Blackfyre Rebellion, just given the fact, like, it wasn't really even a rebellion. It was like a plot that was destroyed in its infancy. Like, it didn't even get anywhere. And so Gorman Peake is present throughout the 3rd novella, and so if you have not read the 3rd novella, this is going to be massive spoilers for you. I'd highly recommend reading it, especially in preparation to the show coming out, The Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which that'll be season 3, the stuff I'm about to reference. But either way, Gorman was trying to crown Daemon II Blackfyre, hoping that Aegor Rivers would eventually help. Didn't end up going that way, and we see that in 212 AC, he was subsequently executed for treason as his plan was foiled by, well, Bloodraven, Egg, and Dunk. It did not go well at all. So the Peakes once again have another treason. It's honestly surprising that they didn't lose their castle and House Peake wasn't extinguished for committing treason literally back to back. And so this would get to then their third rebellion. Yes, the Peakes are an active participant in 3 rebellions in a row that all fail. And we could talk about the Peake Uprising. I've done a video on it before, but I think the main purpose of the Peake Uprising and why the Peakes did it was to more or less try and targetedly kill Maekar to then hopefully start another Blackfyre rebellion, which then would help them, gain and be elevated in power. That does work to some degree, as Maekar is killed during the Peake Uprising. It's a huge blow to House Targaryen and creates a lot of uncertainty about the dynasty overall. But it also leads to the point of the Peakes lose. Now, once again, how was House Peake allowed to live from this? Why weren't they killed and executed? I guess blame Egg, because I think this is the moment the House Peake should have been taken out. And so the Peake Uprising in 233 would basically spell the end of any real Peake influence. And for the most part, a lot of House Peake is actually in the Golden Company. A lot of the Peakes that we even know of in the main story are actually with young Griff and the Golden Company coming over to crown young Griff and Aegon and all that stuff. So at this moment, the Peakes are not irrelevant. Let's not go that far, but they have fallen far from where they once were. And that is the history of House Peake, how they rose to power and then eventually lost it, going basically face first into the concrete as they lost multiple rebellions. They rolled the dice, they tried to play the Game of Thrones, and they didn't lose everything, even though they should have. But that begs the question, can the Golden Company restore the Peakes to their former glory? I highly doubt it, but we will have to see. Today we're going to cover the Dreadfort, the history of it, kind of similar to the way we talked about the Night Fort, just with the Dreadfort. And the Dreadfort, just on the name, I mean, it's a really eerie place. It is kind of mysterious. We've only been there one single time in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's not a place, I would say, that is covered in history as much as something like the Night Fort or Winterfell or some of the other major castles, but I did want to talk about it as a minor castle because, well, it is playing a significant role in the Winds of Winter, and we've even seen Stannis contemplating trying to attack the Dreadfort, but it doesn't end up going that way because, well, 1, it's a trap, and 2, Jon Snow talks him out of it. But either way, the Dreadfort is really interesting because from everything that I looked at on research, the Dreadfort has never actually been conquered. Nobody has been able to take it. It's kind of similar to something like Storm's End outside of, well, Storm's End is probably a bigger and better defensible castle. But in terms of the North, I mean, Winterfell's been taken more times than the Dreadfort has. I mean, easily. The Boltons throughout their history have, at a number of times, burned Winterfell, which is kind of ironic given the fact that in A Song of Ice and Fire, they added to that tally, burning Winterfell through Ramsay. But today's video, we're going to go through the Dreadfort, and then Sunday's video, we're going to talk about, is Roose Bolton a vampire? A little bit about the history of House Bolton, and a little bit of the susness of the character of Roose Bolton. So, starting out with House Bolton, they are a house that is about as old as House Stark. They come from the First Men and go all the way back even to the Long Night. So they're a very ancient house. And one thing that you kind of have to understand with House Bolton is, especially at the beginning when you're thinking about everything they're doing, they're making their banners a flayed man. They're naming their castle the Dreadfort. They very much rule with fear. They're very different than, say, House Stark in that manner. And you think about all the stories are being told about how they would dress up in the skins of their slain enemies, and that's even maybe how they were able to conquer Winterfell multiple times. They have a very dark, cruel, mysterious past that we just don't really know a lot about. All we do know is that at the height of their power, House Bolton, for the most part, seemed to control most of the eastern coast of the North. At one point, their kingdom stretched from the last river in the White Knife to the Sheepshed Hills. Now, just so I can show you guys kind of on a map, that really means their lands expanded all the way down to almost where the Hornwood land is. It also makes sense as to why later we see Ramsay wanting to get that back, because that's some of the land that they seem to have lost over the years of rebelling against the Starks. And also, you think about where their castle is situated in the Dreadfort, is it's right on a river. And it's also kind of where you have a narrow stretch of where there's only a little bit of land if you actually wanted to go south, say, White Harbor or to the Hornwood Lands. There's only a little bit of a strip of land that comes right past the Dreadfort. So the Dreadfort is positioned well because, well, you're already on a river that will extend then to the ocean. It'll be good for shipping and things like that. It's really well situated in terms of that. A lot of things you see in ancient history is you always needed to position your castle near some type of body of water for trade and even fishing, food, things like that. So on the basis of that, the Dreadfort is positioned quite well. But then also it kind of stands as like an outpost in a lot of ways because you can control any of the land trade, or if any armies are trying to come to the south more or less, or at least on the eastern side of the north, you would kind of pass right past the Dreadfort. That is why in a lot of ways I think House Bolton was so powerful. They're really the only house that rivals House Stark in terms of power and is ever able to really stand up to them in a meaningful way. A lot of it, I think, comes from just being able to control trade, being able to control a lot of land mass, and that is a really big part of the Dreadfort. And so you see that right away as they were once called the Red Kings, very fitting given their sigil being kind of like this red and pink sigil with the flayed man, very much meant to strike fear in their enemies. Very different than some other houses, like maybe, House Tyrell, like theirs isn't really supposed to strike fear or anything like that. It's kind of interesting the way we look at House Tyrell's sigil because it's almost like not threatening. You shouldn't be threatened by us, and we work kind of in the background and we try to marry and gain power that way. Very different here with the Red Kings of the Boltons, more or less. So I then want to kind of describe the Dreadfort. Now, like I said, we've only been to the Dreadfort one time, and we've only been there very briefly. In A Dance with Dragons, with Theon's first chapter, we do see the Dreadfort all but very briefly. We get a little bit of its descriptions and things like that. The layout of the Dreadfort is a strong fortress with thick stone walls and massive towers. The castle has triangular merlons which look like sharp stone teeth. Even the castle itself looks very intimidating. Again, House Bolton is completely based on fear factor, and that's why they've been able to survive so long, is that you don't want to mess with House Bolton because of what will come from it. The great hall of the Dreadfort is dim and smoky, with rows of torches grasped by skeletal human hands jutting from the walls. Even just simple things like, their torches are extremely, weird. It almost looks like there's human hands that have been made into these torches. Everything is built on fear. So when we look at House Bolton, they're not one of these nuanced houses in terms of they have some good people in their house and they have some bad people in their house. House Bolton is obviously painted by George as the villains of the North. And can you really fault people for not liking House Bolton just based on the way they portray themselves? Think about our first introduction into House Bolton through A Song of Ice and Fire. Our first two ones that stick out to me are when Ned thinks about Robert's Rebellion and how Roose Bolton was kind of a cruel man. He wanted to kill Barristan Selmy just because he stayed true to his vows and fought for the Mad King. And so we see that doesn't end up happening. Robert likes to pardon people, even that he's defeated and that have gone against him. We see he does that quite a lot. It's one of his strengths and flaws. I think being able to make peace with your enemies or people that you fought against is a very valuable skill. But I think at times he also didn't do enough in terms, especially House Lannister. Think about the next time we really hear about House Bolton and we're introduced into them. It's really Robb Stark when Catelyn comes back and reunites with Robb as Robb is starting to move south. He gets to Moat Cailin. Robb kind of describes Roose as being this person that whenever he looks at him, all he can imagine is this secret room within the Dreadfort of them flaying their enemies. And that's what House Bolton has done for thousands of years, is building up that reputation and keeping you off balance and fearing them. And that goes even further because nobody's been able to actually take the Dreadfort and nobody's been able to defeat the Boltons. The Boltons have defeated the Starks multiple times and have rebelled against the Starks multiple points and broken their vows of, say, they swear an allegiance to them or they put away their crown. They have at multiple points been a house that could have been extinguished because of their loyalties, but they've been able to live on because of their strength. Because taking the Dreadfort would just take years of effort of trying to siege them, and even that would be very difficult given the Dreadfort's position. And also trying to take the castle by storm, you would lose probably thousands of men, even if you had more men than the Dreadfort and House Bolton. So you see that right away. Like House Bolton, they have grown a reputation that even puts someone like Robb, who's willing to stand up to like the Great John, for instance. But against Roose, he kind of feels a little off balance. But getting back to the layout of the Dreadfort, but also in its great hall, it had long tables that stood behind a dais with a high table in the seat of the Lord of the Dreadfort. The hall has a vaulted ceiling and wooden rafters turned black from smoke. The kennels are located in the Dreadfort's yard, and steep steps lead down to the dungeons. This is the thing that the Dreadfort is known most for its torture rooms, and also this alleged room where the Boltons have the skins of their enemies. And some even believe that they use these skins almost similar to the way the Faceless Men use the faces to transform into other people. And even when we think about the way that House Bolton was able to take out Winterfell and burn it and sack it, the rumor that we have is that the way that they were actually able to do that is House Bolton would wear the skins of like a prince of Winterfell or anything like that, and they would sneak into the castle. That is kind of interesting, given that Winterfell is this really strong castle. Now, the really big difference is the Winterfell that we see by the time of the main story is very different than the Winterfell that would have been during these early years in the Bolton and Stark history. And so that's really important to understand, that we don't really know how defensible and strong Winterfell was. But even if it was, it makes sense that there was trickery that was done by the Boltons, because the Boltons, yes, were able to rival the power of House Stark, but I would assume that House Stark was a little bit more powerful than the Boltons, because you got to remember a lot of points in which the Boltons rebel against the Starks, it seems like it's literally just their house. It's not even other houses in the north. It is mainly House Bolton. Now we'll talk about another house a little bit later in House Grey Stark of the Wolf's Den. But just know, in these early years for the Dreadfort, it was kind of seen in a way of like how we look at Maegor. So Maegor would always have Tiana of the Tower. She would like torture people in the black cells and do all these things, and it gave it a really bad reputation. Like, take that and then just apply it to the north. That's the way House Bolton is looked at. And so the Dreadfort over the years, it was never taken. Nobody was ever able to take the Dreadfort from what we've been told by George. Now, could George, come up with something different in the next book he writes, if we ever get a Fire and Blood Part 2, or we get more of the history of House Bolton? Could this be rewritten? Yes. There's not a lot to go off of with House Bolton. We know in terms of during the Age of Heroes, this is when kind of the Dreadfort was becoming their seat of power. And we know that the Boltons eventually submitted to the kings in the north from House Stark near the start of the coming of the Andals to Westeros. And it's interesting because we don't necessarily know why, House Bolton submitted to the kings of the north and the Starks. I would likely think that it was more of a self-preservation idea with, yes, we don't like the Starks, but we also don't like the Andals coming over and, bringing all their new ideologies and all this other stuff. And that is more on the reason why I think House Bolton went with House Stark, just based upon the fact that, like, this wouldn't stop their rebellions. Like the Red Kings and the Boltons would at multiple times go against House Stark. But something else I think is interesting that I do want to bring up, we talked about the Night's King in the last really castle video. I think it's interesting because a rumor we have is that that person, the Night's King, could end up actually being a Bolton. And it would make sense given on the fact that House Bolton is our villainous house, more or less. And it would be really interesting if we look at the Night's King, and if he was, using the skins of his enemies. It would make sense if he was a Bolton. It would also go to the idea, like, when we look at Roose Bolton, he has a very interesting look in terms of his eyes and the way he almost seems to have this very soft voice and whispering, and he leeches himself. It's really interesting to think about, if the Night's King did actually reproduce with this. It seems like his queen was an other or something along that line. And what if that then created the next line for the Boltons? Like their child actually survived and went back to the Dreadfort, maybe being handled by some other person at the Dreadfort. We don't know a lot about who was ruling House Bolton at that point. Like we don't know if the Night's King, if he was a Bolton, did he have a brother there, or similar to Benjen and Ned at the beginning of the story. It'd be really interesting. There's a lot to explore with that, and we're definitely going to talk about that a lot more in Sunday's video, but I really did want to bring that up here. But we do know that the Boltons achieved some successes against the Starks, with King Royce II and King Royce IV burning Winterfell. According to rumor, some Boltons wore the flayed skins of Stark princes and lords, such as the son of Bael the Bard, as cloaks during the Age of Heroes. We know that the last king, Rogar the Huntsman, submitted to Winterfell when the coming of the Andals to Westeros was beginning, like I mentioned earlier, and that King Theon Stark, the Hungry Wolf, and the Boltons defeated Argo Sevenstar and his Andals in the Battle of the Weeping Water. And as they would become vassals to Winterfell, that would not end the issues going on between House Bolton and House Stark. The Dreadfort rose in an unsuccessful rebellion with the Grey Starks of the Wolf's Den against the Starks. And it makes sense given their proximity. The Wolf's Den is more or less where White Harbor is at this point, and they are on the eastern side. So the southeastern, I should probably say, more or less rose in defiance of Winterfell. Now, it's interesting, though, is that this rebellion did not go well for the Boltons. They ended up losing this. But for their house, they ended up surviving. Nothing actually occurred to them. I mean, they probably lost lands, of course, and probably lost maybe captives or hostages. But the Grey Starks did not. The Grey Starks were basically completely wiped out. And that's really key here, because it tells you that House Bolton was not easily just deposed, especially because of how powerful they were at this point. You couldn't just, remove them. And that's really important to understand as well. We then skip forward in time a bit, but the Boltons then threatened Winterfell during the reign of King Edric Snowbeard. At some point, unspecified centuries ago, the Boltons rebelled against the Starks as the Stark armies besieged the Dreadfort for 2 years before the Boltons capitulated to King Harlan Stark and dipped their banners once more. But it's very important to understand, the Dreadfort surrendered. It wasn't taken. This was a 2-year-long siege that eventually the Boltons realized, okay, we can't defy them anymore. But the Dreadfort was never taken. The Dreadfort held strong. If it stood for 2 years, that means it was a formidable enough castle that even the Starks didn't want to risk all of their men dying trying to take the castle, and they were content to just wait. So I really want to point that out, is that the Dreadfort, in my opinion, is a very slept-on castle. Especially in the north. I would say it's up there as probably the best castle in the north. Around 1,000 years ago, the Boltons then bent their knees to Winterfell and agreed to abandon their practice of flaying. It is rumored the skins of their enemies hang in a room within the Dreadfort, however, and I think it's very clear that the flayings did not stop. But what did occur is that House Bolton started to have to do it a bit more secretly. They couldn't openly do it as much, or they'd risk the wrath of House Stark, and by this point, the Boltons had been beaten down enough times to where they couldn't really openly rival House Stark. House Stark had the love of most of the northern houses that would spring up during this point, or even the older ones, and House Bolton just couldn't stand alone against them. It's kind of similar to House Frey with the Riverlands, and so you see why that alliance works so well, because you have the Boltons, who are really ancestral enemies to the Starks. You have the Freys that are looked really not fondly upon by Westeros in general because of them being a much newer house and the way that they earned their power and wealth. But both houses, they are your second tier. If there's Winterfell and there's Riverrun, well, your next tiers are, well, the Twins and the Dreadfort. That's the way I think those work so well. And you even think about something like the First Blackfire Rebellion. The one thing that you see with the First Blackfire Rebellion is that a lot of Dan Blackfire's support comes from those second tier houses, those houses that were looking to get to becoming the top dog in their region. And so, for instance, you had houses like House Peake, for instance, that was trying to rival houses like House Hightower and House Tyrell. But nothing really would come from the Boltons during the era of Aegon Targaryen. They backed House Stark and bent the knee. And so there's not a lot to talk about. I talked about earlier how Ned Stark fought in Robert's Rebellion and what Roose Bolton suggested in terms of killing Barristan Selmy. And the last real notable thing that happens before A Song of Ice and Fire is that we know Domeric Bolton, Roose's son and heir, was allegedly killed by his half-brother, Ramsay Snow. So that is really the history that we have of kind of both House Bolton, but also the Dreadfort. And so there's not a lot to talk about in terms of the Dreadfort itself when we start diving into some of the theories about House Bolton. But I'll say this about the Dreadfort. The Dreadfort and the Nightfort are very similar in terms of their reputation, outside of just the Nightfort is more magical in terms of it's on the wall and all of the horrible, cruel things that have happened there have given it a very ill reputation. The Dreadfort is more it is openly, this is supposed to make people fear us. It's supposed to put that doubt in people's heads that if you go against us, this is what will happen to you. You will be flayed. One of the worst things that could possibly happen to a person. And especially when you have someone like Roose, who kind of keeps his reign very quiet. He doesn't let things get out to House Stark about what's going on in his lands. And you can see that there's that bitter rivalry between the two. But House Bolton was really looking for that one thing that could put them back on top. And that's what they got during the War of the Five Kings. Now, I don't think that's going to end up well for them, but it's what House Bolton did.